All right, next we'll hear from Brandon Hunter from Princeton University, also from the Anthropology Department.
Morning. Thank you, everyone. So the paper I'm going to read is Black Skins, White Guns Towards a Materialist Reading of Racial Gun Violence. Over the past several years, activists across the United States have brought renewed attention to the issue of racial gun violence at the hands of police and vigilantes alike. In 2012, public outcry erupted over the murder of Trayvon Martin at the hands of George Zimmerman, when Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch captain, reported a suspicious person to 911. Despite being instructed by the 911 operator not to approach Martin, Zimmerman defied those orders, and after a confrontation with Martin, the scene ended with Martin's death and Zimmerman claiming self-defense. The trial revealed that that Martin was in fact unarmed, and in the process of returning home after purchasing a bag of Skittles from a nearby convenience store. What made him suspicious of Zimmerman were his black skin and his black hoodie, and the fact that for Zimmerman, both were unwelcome in the gated community where Zimmerman lived. For people of color in the United States, Martin's murder serves as a reminder of the ominous potential for racial gun violence and the life or death stakes that accompany interactions with police and armed whites. Responses to these tragedies have illuminated the ways racial bias and racial inequality can produce violence, but in doing so the focus has been on the individual perpetrator and their racist motivations. But what about the objects? What about the gun? In thinking in line with a burgeoning group of scholars interested in racism as a phenomenon, as a thing that happens in Imani Perry's terms, this essay asks and attempts to answer how objects are part of that phenomenological framework, how they are constitutive of these happenings. Admittedly, the gun is not the only source of racial violence in the United States, yet between police and vigilantes alike, gun violence continues to claim the most lives. While it might be argued that such violence would continue even in the absence of the gun, underlying such a pessimistic view is the belief that race and racism lies in the mind and in the immaterial. The objects around us can do whatever we would like them to. But as new materialist scholars have observed, this preference for the immaterial reflects a choice rather than a claim of truth, as an increasing body of work has demonstrated how the material world constrains, shapes, and makes possible, even as it is altered by our interventions. Viewing race and racism along this conceptual framing reveals race not as a stable category, but as an outcome of materials, people, and places coming together over time to create the semblance of continuity we understand as race. The gun is both exemplary of how we might consider the role of objects in the production of race, and yet central to thinking through racial violence in the United States. The gun, like many objects, is unevenly distributed and connected to a material system that is historically rooted in particular capitalist formations that follow into the present. At the same time, the gun is also an actuant, playing its own role in the ontological field of other objects. Where some new materialists imagine this field as flattened, this essay argues along with others that such flatness risks ignoring the connections of the past to the present, and undermines an account of race that takes inventory of the larger and smaller roles played by its component parts at particular moments. When George Zimmerman shot Trayvon Martin, a flattened ontological framework might shift our attention to the very air both parties breathed before their fateful encounter, or the ground they walked on, or the shoes on their feet. But these objects and materials, while at work, are arguably not as important as Martin's dark skin, his black hoodie, and Zimmerman's pocket handgun. And yet in the context of Eric Garner, it is air or the lack of air caused by the officer's chokehold that played a more prominent role in the tragedy than the weapons the officers were holding that day. As Saldana reminds us, pure flatness is an epistemological illusion, for it can only be human perspective that calls everything ontologically flat. Some objects are more important than others, and in the case of contemporary racial violence, the gun is key. The fact the gun has woven itself into these tragedies is not an accident, but rather an historical outcome that continues to unfold in the present. The American gun is as much a part of American mythology as it is an object crucial to American empire, facilitating indigenous subjugation, westward expansion, and American conquest outside the Western Hemisphere. The early colonists saw the gun as a tool for protection against Native Americans, and in the New England colonial towns, colonies even required adult males to have a musket in possession at all times. In the Revolutionary War, George Washington settled on Springfield, Massachusetts, at the site of the manufacture of weapons for the war effort. And after American independence was achieved and industrialization found its way to New England, America's great gun manufacturers got their start. From the Sharp's Buffalo rifle to the Colt revolver, the gun is the center stage in every moment of American history. Yet this history is also one of white supremacy and the accompanying violence of the gun as it pacified the West, brought down slave rebellions, and in the late 1800s and early 1900s quelled workers' movements and labor action. As a tool capable of inflicting pain easily and at a distance, the gun's power rests with its convenience, a technological feature that would only improve over time. Before the Industrial Revolution, guns were expensive to purchase and maintain, but with mass production and advancements in gun design, guns lasted longer and wore less easily, requiring gun manufacturers to create markets for their products. It is rumored Samuel Colt coined the term new and improved, turning the gun from a tool of conquest or a necessity of rural life to a recreational hobby through activities like sports hunting and marksmanship competitions. While this kept gun manufacturers profitable during the first part of the 20th century, changes in American demographics and disinterest in hunting shrunk the gun market, leading gun manufacturers to worry about the future of their product. The decline of the popularity of the gun in the mid-20th century was also attributed to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which sparked a national conversation on gun control. Before the 1970s, leaders on both sides of the political aisle viewed gun control as a sensible response to the obvious dangers that might come about should people be permitted to march in the streets with their weapons, as had happened in 1967 when the Black Panther Party carried out an armed demonstration in the state capitol building in Sacramento. The turn to gun rights and the need for everyday people to possess a weapon for personal safety accompanied concerns over crime. This emerged at the same time as Nixon's plea for law and order and the start of the war on drugs, racist dog whistles that formed part of the Republican Southern strategy. These shifts transformed the National Rifle Association from an organization for gun safety and recreation into a political organization advocating for the protection and expansion of guns' rights. Gun manufacturers began supporting a political campaign that set law-abiding citizens against the foil of a population of uncontrollable and ruthless criminals. Tough-on-crime legislation would eventually morph into public concerns around the super predator, racist undertones about whom the gun was designed to protect and whom it was designed to protect against. Even after horrific mass shootings like Columbine, their political success culminated in 2005 when Congress passed the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, a bill that immunized gun manufacturers, dealers, and distributors from civil liability for damages caused by guns. The law paralleled moves at the state level to remove gun control restrictions, and eventually bolstered by the Supreme Court's decision in District of Columbia v. Heller and McDonald v. Chicago, where the court ruled that implied in the Second Amendment was an individual's right to self-defense. While gun control advocates have made renewed attempts to institute an assault rifle ban following a number of notable mass shootings, rifles only account for 3% of gun sales. The vast majority has come from home defense weapons and smaller concealed carry handguns. This shift has accompanied a slew of technological advancements in gun design and engineering that emphasize smaller, concealable pistols that are more powerful and more deadly than ever before. This fear, however, has not been marketed to everyone. Instead, gun manufacturers and gun rights organizations like the NRA tap into the racialized imagination of white America. Nearly 76 million American households own at least one firearm, but broken down by race, whites account for 41% of whites own a firearm, with Black and Latino households each owning half as many guns. With some exception, American gun culture is unmistakably white and male, a consequence of political messaging and gun manufacturer marketing that has taken on a life of its own through the hundreds of websites, message boards, gun clubs, and shooting ranges abundantly scattered across the country. Browsing through some of the most popular gun enthusiast magazine websites, one understands, in Sarah Ahmed's terms, that one is entering white space. Images of white men in hunting gear are crouched low and looking through the sight of a rifle are everywhere, paired with patriotic iconography like waving American flags and majestic bald eagles. These images situate the gun in a racial assemblage that connects it to white skin and white safety. Such images are intentional just as much as they are normalized, springing from the same collusions between gun manufacturers, interest groups, and politicians that have created the legal, political, and economic environment that distributes the gun in particular ways and sanctions its use in particular contexts. They are bolstered by an opposite set of images, the black or brown criminal that appears across the media spectrum, from movie and television shows that often depict an armed and dangerous black or brown youth, to the news media that regularly reports on violent crime carried out by black or brown individuals in urban centers across the country. At the macro level, the gun can be understood as a coordination of political, legal, economic, and cultural forces. These forces produce a material setting that continues to unfold in the day-to-day practices of gun culture and in the effects gun possession has on the person. Psychologist Witten Brockmull found that people in possession of a weapon are more likely to believe others around them possess a gun, while another study found that gun owners are more angry and impulsive. Gun enthusiast websites showcase the embodied practices of gun ownership. The time spent at shooting ranges, gun cleaning, practicing quick withdrawal of a weapon from one's pocket, all punctuated by discussions of weight, size, and material of the weapon. One review of a popular pistol model went so far as to describe how men with big hands could effectively handle smaller pistols, while others share tips on ensuring maximum comfort and concealability, noting how with the right accessories, even a gun owner wearing a Speedo can conceal their firearm. Shapiro argues that in fetishizing the gun, we miss the deeper ideology underlying gun culture in America. But the gun is an object central to this ideology. It is the material form that leaves traces of the political, legal, and economic structure of this ideology. But as a thing to possess, it is an actuant in the assemblage of white identity, literally transforming the cognition and bodily practices of white gun owners. In May 2016, George Zimmerman successfully auctioned the handgun he used to murder Trayvon Martin. The auction was not the first time Zimmerman went to the public for financial assistance and support. Shortly after he was charged with Martin's murder, Zimmerman created a website that solicited donations for his litigation costs during the trial period. As he claimed both during and after the trial, the attacks against him were part of a racist witch hunt and an attempt to delegitimize and undermine gun rights successes like Stand Your Ground. His appeal helped attract a throng of supporters nationwide and garnered the attention of leading gun rights advocates and organizations, with the NRA even using the Zimmerman trial to publicly state that self-defense was a fundamental human right and ought to be defended against attacks. With the coordinated support of right-wing politicians, gun rights organizations, and those involved in the gun business, Zimmerman managed to spin a story and turn himself into a victim, staking the outcome of the trial as a matter of human rights for gun owners. Zimmerman's spin crafted an appeal that folded his action into the protective field of whiteness, a process that simultaneously inscribed the 14-year-old Martin as a dangerous, troublesome black youth. While conservative commentators were quick to point out Zimmerman's half-Latino identity, Zimmerman's gun and his insistence that he was acting in self-defense against an uncontrollable Martin permitted him to literally and figuratively invest in whiteness. The gun whitened Zimmerman's skin at the same time that it darkened Martin's, replaying a now routine American story in which the white vigilante emerges as a redeemable figure. What led to Zimmerman and Martin's encounter cannot be understood outside the elaborate system of gun distribution facilitated by gun rights advocates and politicians. In 1987, Florida became a concealed carry state, allowing license holders to possess a handgun on their person and concealed from view. Over the years, changes in Florida's concealed carry laws resulted in an incredibly high number of permit holders, with more than 700,000 active holders in Florida at the moment. Over the years, Florida has cultivated a deeply embedded gun culture, with one investigation showing the average Florida resident lived within 10 miles of a gun dealer, and that there are 3.0 the number of gun dealers in Florida than post offices. Florida's concealed carry provisions sit together with other gun regulations that make it easier for anyone in Florida to possess a weapon, including allowing the private sale of firearms without a background check, no waiting period for gun purchases, and a statewide regulation that prohibits local municipalities from implementing gun regulations stricter than state law. Regulations that do exist that focus on the kind of gun one is able to possess, with state laws banning the sale of machine guns and excluding long guns from concealed carry permits. The result is a regulatory environment skewed towards handguns, especially smaller, concealable, lightweight handguns like the one Zimmerman used to murder Martin. Long before Zimmerman shot Martin, he purchased a Caltech PF9, one of the lightest and flattest 9mm pistols ever mass-produced. Described as a hybrid model, it was designed to improve on the P11 and P3AT models and is meant as a concealed sidearm for law enforcement and personal self-defense. The maker of Zimmerman's weapon, Caltech, is an American gun manufacturer based in Cocoa, Florida, about an hour southeast from Sanford, where Martin was shot. In the spirit of tasteless publicity stunts, Martin visited the company before the trial, taking a tour of the premises and affirming his love of firearms. According to gun enthusiasts, Caltech has made a name for itself by designing lightweight pistols for the express purpose of concealed carry, a move that has put the company in the top 5 of American gun manufacturers. But guns, of course, are not distributed evenly. This is in part the result of the high cost of firearms in the United States, but also, as Robert Chase and Uhuru Williams point out, the result of unevenly enforced laws that routinely punish black and brown individuals for gun possession. As they note, the concealed carry movement and the loosening of gun regulations in Florida also paralleled tough-on-crime measures that created new and harsher penalties for those who committed a crime with a firearm. The claim of self-defense is more accessible to whites, especially when the victim is a person of color. The story of Marissa Alexander, an African-American woman from Jacksonville, makes this point devastatingly clear. After years of dealing with an abusive partner, in 2010, Alexander fired a warning shot after her husband threatened her with violence. In 2012, Alexander was sentenced to 20 years in prison when a Florida judge rejected her claim of immunity under Florida's Stand Your Ground provision, instead using the state's mandatory minimum for gun-related crimes to dot a long, harsh sentence. Alexander, of course, was not the poster child of the gun rights movement, nor was she able to count on the NRA and others for moral and financial support, despite her more compelling story as a survivor of domestic abuse. Unlike Zimmerman, Alexander's race and gender precluded her from accessing the privileges of whiteness afforded to others who possess a weapon. It was instead her use of a gun that triggered her violation of a prevailing racial code, thus making her possession of a weapon recognizable and punishable by the state. Zimmerman's gun allowed him to invest in whiteness, while those very same forces turned on Alexander, punishing her for gun ownership. In this sense, we can follow the gun and trace its social life, but doing so is not possible without addressing the fact such distribution is mediated by a regulatory environment and racist consumer desire that are themselves a symbolic and material production of larger systemic forces. Such forces have not only led to the proliferation of the gun, but constitute a series of technological advancements that have made the gun lighter, smaller, concealable, and more deadly. Yet in its symbolic register, it is an object that lightened Zimmerman's skin, that allowed him to evade prosecution while simultaneously darkening Martin, situating him as a dangerous and troublesome youth, and thus the object of Zimmerman's interventions that evening. The black male, as John Escow reminds us, has always attracted the suspicion of whites, his mere stare the sight of white panic. Yet in the context of decades of gun marketing and racist political dog whistles about crime, Zimmerman's gun heightened that panic, instilling in him the fear and power he likely did not possess on his own. It might be obvious that Zimmerman's gun afforded the possibility of an incident of gun violence, but what is less obvious are the forces at work that make Martin's death and the thousands of others like it a common occurrence. Without the gun, one wonders whether Zimmerman would have ignored the 911 operator's instructions, whether instead a story of racial gun violence may become a story of racist police harassment, or perhaps nothing at all. And then again, one wonders if the suspicion and fear Zimmerman invoked was his from the start, that it didn't come pre-packaged with the pocket pistol he purchased beforehand. Whiteness resists its destruction by pretending to be nothing at all, by escaping view and thus settling into the normalcy of everyday life. It is, I insist, not just the shooting, but the fact whites can possess a gun in the first place and carry that gun freely without suspicion or scrutiny, literally and figuratively concealed from view. It is, as Tammy Rice's story disturbingly cautions, a privilege not afforded to black or brown Americans. Such questions, I believe, should provoke us to devote attention to the objects that give shape and substance to our social world, that work with us, alongside us, and even against us to give that world meaning. Thanks.